This is a really important subject. Why did the Soviet Union collapse? Not only because, at the time of the Russian Revolution, this event brought hope to millions of working class people all over the world. That the working class as a class can run society. It was the Russian Revolution was an example of an unrest that was happening everywhere. We talked about the attempt of the German working class at making revolution in 1918, and how its failure had massively impacted on the situation in Russia and impacted on the outlook for revolution in Russia. It's also an important subject because of the terrible crimes committed eventually in the name of socialism in the Soviet Union. Plus, many bourgeois commentators after 1991 declared that now that's the end of history. Fukuyama, famous saying. This is now, we've proven that socialism is totally incapable of doing anything. There clearly can't be any alternative to capitalism. Capitalism is it, and shall be there forever and ever and ever. And it became very difficult for people to make the argument for socialism for left-wingers. You could argue that still makes the existence and then the collapse of the Soviet Union quite difficult to call yourself a communist or a socialist, because that's, you had the Soviet Union as a very bad example. So it's I think very pertinent question that we look at this. We've had Pat Byrne already looked at the aftermath of the Russian Revolution with quite some interesting insights, which was very useful. And in that session, we did discuss the need to look in this a bit more detail and actually look at why the Soviet Union collapsed. Was it outside forces, inside forces, a bit of both, etc. So I'm very glad that we're being joined tonight by Jack Conrad. He's the author of a number of books, I think including one on the Soviet Union and being in the pipeline, and writes for The Weekly Worker. He will be talking for about 35-40 minutes, and then there's plenty of time for questions and issues from the floor, comments from the floor if you want to engage. I should have said who I am. I'm Tina Workman. I'm the co-chair of Labour Against the Witch Hunt and also secretary of Labour Left Alliance. And I'm joined as a co-chair by Antoinette, who will be also doing some chairing later on. And that's enough from us. Bringing in John now. Jack, sorry to...
Right. Okay, thanks very much. Yeah, I think that the question of the Soviet Union still is with us. Clearly, as Tina said in her opening remarks, this is something that's going to be used against the left, and the stronger that the left becomes, the more that they will use the Soviet Union as one of their many weapons against us. And I suppose that for those that considered the Soviet Union in 1991 as some sort of socialism, we've actually got to come up with convincing answers. To me, the collapse of the Soviet Union doesn't disprove the socialist project. It certainly doesn't disprove Marxism. My argument would certainly be that to analyze the Soviet Union, to get to grips with what it was and why it collapsed, the most effective tools that we have available are the tools of Marxism. So in terms of sort of answering the question of this talk, I think that what I would emphasize is the actual moment of collapse in August 1991. That was an accident. The Soviet Union could have collapsed, 5 years before. It could have lasted some considerable time after 1991. So my own particular take on it was that the actual date was an accident, but why the system came to an end, I think can be grasped if we actually ask the most profound questions about the nature of the system itself, because although I said that capitalism scored a victory with the collapse of the Soviet Union, it has to be said that many on the left were coming up with various ideas to actually describe the reality of the Soviet Union, because the fact of the matter was that the Soviet Union was a society that nobody on the left expected. So in that sense, we were dealing not only in the 1920s, 1930s with a novel situation, we were dealing with a situation that no Marxist would have predicted or could have predicted. I suppose if you took the revolutionaries of 1917, for them, the Russian Revolution was going to act as a spark. Germany has already been mentioned. What they would have expected is either to have gone down to counter-revolution coming from outside, or counter-revolution sparked from inside. What they didn't expect was that they themselves, the system that they were defending, actually evolved in the direction it was. And from my angle, it evolved in a direction that was anti-socialist, anti-working working class. Okay, so I've already mentioned various Marxists and their attempts to explain what was. Of course, the biggest section of the left, whether that's sort of left reformist or official communist, this became their model. The left reformists, of course, would say that they liked what was happening in the Soviet Union, except for the terror or the one-party state or the lack of democracy. Nonetheless, this system served as their paradigm of what socialism was going to look like. There were others, of course, who critiqued the reality of the Soviet Union. You could mention Trotsky's theory of the degenerate worker state, that what was needed was a political revolution and that this would be the workers doing it. Various theories of state capitalism were developed. Obviously, the most well-known in Britain, at least, is the one propounded by Tony Cliff. There's also been various attempts to describe the Soviet Union as some sort of bureaucratic collectivism. In my view, these theories don't stand up to a serious examination, and I think they've been disproved by life itself. When the Soviet Union collapsed, it wasn't because of the workers carrying out a political revolution. The workers didn't defend their supposed system. When we look at Tony Cliff's theory of bureaucratic state capitalism, he emphasized that this was the highest stage capitalism could reach. After that, there was socialism. Well, the Soviet Union actually collapsed. It didn't go towards socialism. And his lieutenant, Chris Harman, talked about history moving sideways. I don't think a particularly convincing analysis. Bureaucratic collectivism placed the Soviet Union above capitalism in general, and thought that it would act as some sort of antechamber for socialist development. Well, it didn't happen. Okay, so what was the Soviet Union and why did it collapse? In my own work actually takes as its sort of starting point a parallel with Marx's Capital. Everyone will know in Marx's Capital that he actually begins with the commodity, something that we take for granted in our day-to-day life. And he described the commodity as having two sides: use value and exchange value. And the whole of Capital Volume 1, Volume 2, and Volume 3 flows from that initial starting point. So that for Marx was the atomic unit of society. It was also his starting point in terms of analyzing capitalist social relationships and capitalist dynamics. I think in the Soviet Union, what you had was not the production of commodities, the buying and selling of commodities. You had a product, and that product, I believe, had two sides to it. It had a use value, i.e. we eat it, we wear it, we ride on it, but it also had a plan value. And what we see in terms of the Soviet Union is a tremendous ability to begin with, especially to produce what I would call plan values, i.e. Enterprises were expected to expand production year by year. They were expected to meet targets year by year. And in general, enterprise managers reported to those above tremendous success, except that if you read any report by a general secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, any prime minister, what you get is this constant complaint about the lack of quality. This is something that endures from the beginning of the system to the end of the system. In other words, what we have is runaway success on paper, and yet use values that consumers of all types were disappointed with or appalled by. So that if you were another enterprise further down the line and you were in receipt of still, what you complained about, because that was the reality of that still, is that that still was of appalling quality. It broke. The same with coal. It was full of stones. And that went from other enterprises down to the Soviet consumer. So the sausages were crap. The Lada cars were crap. Televisions famously would explode. So yes, we have this duality of use value and target value. We also have a duality of quantity, tremendously successful in terms of quantity, but a dreadful result when it came to quality. I also think that, again, when discussing the Soviet Union, we actually need to understand that while workers were vital for the system, we all know that in order to produce use values, you need two things, basically. You need nature on the one side, and you need human labor on the other. But human labor, in terms of different social systems, comes in different forms. So we know that there's a difference between slave labor or serf labor and wage labor. Workers under capitalism sell their commodity, sell their ability to labor to the capitalist, and the capitalist exploits that ability to labor and creams off a surplus value. I believe that in the Soviet Union, workers didn't sell their ability to labor. They actually had to deliver their labor by law. There were all manner of anti-parasite laws. There were all sorts of regulations forcing workers to deliver their labor. And if that's the case, we also then need to understand that there was no real category, although I can't say I've been satisfied with my ability to call it something else. So there was no real wages in the Soviet Union. It's true that at the end of each month, the enterprise would hand workers so many rubles, but we need to understand that there was a great deal more about the survival of workers than mere rubles. That rubles weren't money, weren't the universal equivalent. And we need to also understand that from very early on in the history of the Soviet Union, and what I'm talking about really is after the launch of the first 5-year plan, is that what we saw is an extreme labor shortage. And so although there was tremendous oppression and workers were politically atomized, their trade unions weren't organs of defense, they became organs of management. The fact of the matter is that workers could bargain with enterprises in order to extract all manner of different concessions. So what I want to just sort of field in terms of discussion, if we look at Soviet workers, it's certainly true that their living standards compared with the advanced capitalist countries were pretty appalling. On the other hand, it also has to be noted that in spite of the efforts of Center, and that includes Joseph Stalin and Khrushchev and Gorbachev and Brezhnev, the fact of the matter is that year by year, workers saw their living standards improve, and you actually had a situation of where workers, rank and file workers on the factory floor, ended up earning more rubles than engineers, more rubles than doctors, teachers, and all the rest of it. And this was in spite of campaigns launched by the Center. So we again need to understand what is going on. Those that talk about the Soviet Union being totalitarian, that Stalin or the Communist Party were in total control, I think are deluded. The fact of the matter is that workers exercise what is called negative control. And there was a different relationship between the boss, the factory enterprise manager and workers than there was between a capitalist boss and wage labor. If we look at the boss in the Soviet Union, they would connive with their workers against Center. They would connive with their workers to improve their own workers' living standards. They would also connive against Center to ensure that they had the maximum amount of inputs, completely opposite behavior to a capitalist. So a capitalist would attempt to minimize the amount of wage labor that they employ, would attempt to minimize the amount of inputs that they have coming in to their factory or enterprise. As I said, in the Soviet Union, we saw the exact opposite form of behavior. Now, I'm not going to go into, because I haven't got the time, the question of the purges and the role of Stalin as an individual. All I would say, though, is that in terms of Stalin, he knew that he was lying about the success of the Soviet Union. Now, I'm not dismissing that the Soviet Union made progress in the 1930s. I'm not dismissing the Soviet Union's ability to recover from World War II either. Nonetheless, there was a massive gap between what was claimed and what was actually real. And those at the center were acutely aware of that. And so what we had is a system of where the center lied to those below it, but also those below the center lied to the center. And so what we had is a system of systematic lies. Enterprises would report, we've achieved our target by 110%. And yet consumers of every type knew that they weren't surrounded by abundance, they were surrounded by a chronic shortage of products. Okay, so the Soviet Union, as I said before, showed a brilliant ability to take off and industrialize in the 1930s. It showed a brilliant ability to reindustrialize after the horrors of World War II. But what it didn't show a brilliant ability to do is to do what Marxists call how should I put it, extended accumulation. So the classic example of Soviet industrialization was to build a new factory, typically on the American model or the Italian model or the German model, import or copy the latest plant and equipment from the West, put workers into that enterprise, typically women, typically ex-peasants, and what you saw is rapid industrial growth. What it didn't have the ability to do was to revolutionize the means of production on a continuous basis. And the reason for that, I think, lies in the, how should I put it, the self-interest of managers to have peaceful conditions within their enterprises. A capitalist manager, a capitalist owner will constantly be at war with their workers in order to up the rate of exploitation of those workers. A Soviet enterprise manager wanted peace with their workers. So you had a paradoxical situation of where the center would oversee, for example, in the 1980s, the importation of huge numbers of computers from the United States, from Japan, or wherever. And bizarrely, the center would report that these computers were left out in the snow in the middle of a Russian winter because the Soviet manager didn't wish to introduce those computers because it would disrupt production initially, that they simply wanted to carry on as normal. So in my view, this wasn't aberrant behavior on the behalf of this or that crazy manager. There was a rationale behind this behavior. So what we saw really from the late 60s, certainly into the 70s, was the Soviet Union gradually slowing down. And certainly what it did is it ran out of people. And this is something, again, you can read in the reports, of 5-year plans by Nikita Khrushchev or Brezhnev. Certainly under Gorbachev, they're saying, well, Soviet women aren't wanting to have 4 or 5 children. Actually, the birth rate tended to actually become negative, and that what we need, therefore, to do is introduce technology. Well, I've already described the problem that the system actually had with introducing technology. So without fresh supplies of labor and without an ability to introduce on a continuous basis new technology, the Soviet Union stagnated, and at the end actually started to experience negative growth rates. And now, as I said at the beginning, there was no reason why the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. You could have predicted, back in the 1930s, if you had the ability to analyze this new social formation, that eventually it would collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. But I don't think anyone could have predicted the precise date. So we need then to ask ourselves, why did it collapse? And I think the answer really is the loss of faith by those in command of the system in the strength of their system. That's the first answer I would give. Secondly, what I would give is the temptation that those at the center or those close to the center had in becoming capitalists. That if you were even a general secretary or a minister, let alone a enterprise manager, you didn't live like a capitalist. You didn't live in the lap of luxury, and certainly, even if you did, you couldn't guarantee passing that privileged position onto your children. The chances were that the next general secretary would do your children for corruption or sideline them. If we look at the life of a Soviet manager, certainly under Stalin, they tended to last literally something like 6 months before they were carted away by the secret police. But even when they were left in place, the fact of the matter is that their social position tended towards the precarious. And the great advantage of being a capitalist is that you actually own capital. You can pass that capital on to your children. And it's that I think loss of faith and the temptation of becoming capitalists that led those at the center and around the center to actually collapse the system. So we can talk about competition with the United States. We can talk about the underlying contradictions, but I do think that that particular question was vital in terms of answering the particular moment of collapse. I've done half an hour, so I'm going to, I think I'll leave it there actually. I think I'll conclude with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. That was very interesting. I think it does raise a few questions, no doubt. They collapsed the system to become capitalist. That certainly worked out rather well for them, I thought. Quite a few of them did rather well out of it. Okay, comrades, if you want to ask a question or speak, make a comment, please click that button that says raise hand, and then I can see a little blue hand coming up. And then we can bring you in, make you a panelist, it's called. And there's a few hands going up. So I'll bring Lewis in first. Sorry, got you. Caught you there a little bit. Thank you. Hi, Lewis.
How's it going?
Not bad, thank you.
Thanks, Jack. That was a really great overview. I studied the Cold War as an overview back in high school, but the collapse of the Soviet Union is probably something I've never really understand fully. One of the questions I really wanted to ask about was, it's kind of a contentious one, but you described there in describing the Soviet Union of, the concept of state capitalism. It became a state, it was enacting state capitalism rather than socialism. And this is something that I've kind of struggled to work with myself in regards to analyzing the Soviet Union. And one of the things that it kind of goes in a loop is that you look at the Soviet Union as state capitalist, and then people would say, oh, well, that there's actually the opinion of, the Trotskyists and Trotsky, and, that's anti-revolutionary or anti-socialist. And then it kind of, the discussion kind of moves in that direction where, oh, the Soviet Union actually was socialist at one point, and then it became state capitalist, and it's, for me, it's always been, I guess in this, 21st century, we can kind of balance between these 2 points of Trotskyist opinion and, a Marxist-Leninist or, Leninist opinion. And I just wonder where you came down on this. And is it more of an opinion on how you see the Soviet Union, or is it, is there fact in there to say, no, there was never really proper socialism? was developing towards that goal of socialism. It was always pushing there, but it never made it. You know, it's just one of these finer points I've always wanted to talk to someone about who had a bit more knowledge than me, a lot more knowledge than me, actually. Thanks.
David. I'm trying to bring in Rick Simon, but I don't think you've got a camera. If you do have one, can you switch it on, please? I'm bringing in Mark Harrison first. Oh, no, there he is. Okay, I'll bring you in then. Mark, it's Mark Harrison, isn't it? Yeah, sorry. So Mark, Rick, if you do have the camera, can you switch it on, please? So Mark's next.
Yeah, hello, thank you. It's not often you have me inside on a sunny late afternoon. So what I wanted to ask, really, if there was any sort of, when the Soviet Union collapsed, if there was ever any sort of possibility that what went after it could ever take some sort of social democratic course. And also, I wanted to ask him during the NEP period if Jack thinks then the Soviet Union was state capitalist then, or if it was always some sort of other system. Yeah, that's all I wanted to ask him.
Thank you. Okay, Rick just messaged me he doesn't have a camera, so I'm just going to bring him in like that. Oh, sorry, I need to. Okay, sorry. Fire away.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I missed the first 5 minutes of Jack's introduction. I've written on the question of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the subsequent developments in an article in Capital and Class in 2010, where I used the Gramscian concept of passive revolution. And one of the things that Jack refers to in terms of why did it collapse, these seem almost to be sort of psychological factors that you're referring to, Jack, like the loss of faith in the viability of the system and the opportunities for becoming capitalists. In fact, many of the top sort of Politburo members, Central Committee members, didn't really benefit from the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think you have to look lower down, actually, and at particular sectors of the Soviet economy to see where the emerging capitalist class in the 1990s came from. Many of the oligarchs had no real connection to the top elements of the Soviet system. They were often on the periphery, but because, as you quite rightly mentioned, what the lack of quality and so on led to was the development of informal markets within the Soviet economy, which then provided the impetus for particular operators, if you like, within the Soviet economy to then, once communism began to crumble, to actually begin to develop in a much more capitalist direction. And a couple of other things that, if you could address those. Of course, it wasn't, the Soviet Union didn't really collapse at the center, it collapsed at the periphery. That's where the impetus for the disintegration of the Soviet Union came from. First in Eastern Europe, obviously in 1989, the fall of communism and the classic sort of domino pattern, and then the various republics of the Soviet Union, particularly the Baltic states and Ukraine were the most significant, but also obviously there was unrest in Azerbaijan, Armenia and so on, Georgia as well. And that really provided the impetus for the development of the opposition developing around Yeltsin in Russia, who then promoted initially sort of what seemed to be quite interesting, rather more liberal values, but obviously he very quickly moved in a very pro-capitalist direction. And the other thing, just to finish, the other thing that I think needs to be mentioned is neoliberal revolution in the West, and the influence that had both in cranking up the military competition with the Soviet Union, but also the freeing of, if you like, capitalism on a global scale that really began to undermine the sort of the weaknesses of the Soviet economy. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you, Rick. Interesting points. Peter Kennedy is next. Hi, Peter.
Hi there. Just taking these out of the way, right? Thanks, Jack, for that. I think I agree with Jack that we can look at the different political manifestations that emerge later. As the last speaker pointed out, he's not wrong in what he's saying. But I think Jack's point's a valid one in the sense that we go back to the core issues which kind of manifested over time and developed as contradictions, particularly over production, and the fact that there was an internal contradiction really between use value, and the way it operated, and so it was never developed because of pressure on use value to be produced in the right way and distributed and marketed and consumed, and the stamp of quality was never kind of like induced on it because the social relations were different than capitalism, and I think that's what you were saying, Jack. And so the internal contradiction came out within the use value itself as being a kind of corrupt one, and so much so that what was produced was poor quality of low tolerance when you needed high tolerance in certain manufacturing processes, and so that meant the target didn't work either because you were producing more than what you needed to, or they didn't last very long. And so some people then say that what was missing was the market, but that's not the question. I think my question to you is just that on this issue, when it collapsed, and I think you're right, it's quite hard to kind of to guess when it would collapse and that, but the issue, what I would like you to maybe consider and maybe address is what your feelings are on the Cold War. And so the Cold War system was something that might have propped up the Soviet Union as such. And a part of that Cold War was not just America and the influence of the rivalry between so-called West and East, but also the Comintern acting as buffer zones for the Soviet Union itself, so they could trade with them in poor quality goods, so they could share the low productivity, the poor use of labour power across the Comintern, and in many ways that offered them a buffer over time. And then by extension, the Communist International then through the Stalinism, the way it operated on labour movements within the West, not just in the Comintern, the West. And so they offered like a kind of politics which brought into the West in such a way as to kind of buy the Soviet Union time and were more friendly to the Soviet Union in terms of the way the demands of the Communist Party, they were placed on the state to kind of produce this socialism in one country in all sorts of horrible, diverse ways, and one of them being labourism in Great Britain. And so to me it's significant that neoliberalism comes about to vanquish social democracy, and that somehow in the West lays the basis for a weakness for the Soviet Union in the East. And so and it also acts as a kind of like bulwark for the West and neoliberalism to try and attract those bourgeois, petty bourgeois elements and emerging bourgeois class within the satellite states of the Soviet Union and Poland and so forth, and East Germany to give them strength, as it were. So I think all those things might be in the pot, as it were, for leading to the more rapid demise of the Soviet Union, based on its own contradictions, but also why maybe even with those contradictions, it was able to kind of last so long as well. So, okay.
Thanks, Peter. I suggest I bring in Tim as a last speaker in this round, because there have been quite a few comments already, but there are a few people who are asking questions in the Q&A. I'll read them out quickly, John. Okay. Okay, so there's a Carol and a few others have mentioned Chernobyl is a sort of symbolic symbol really of the unwillingness to invest capital in producing quality rather than just quantity. The whole focus was on increasing quantity of output as that was used to measure performance of industry. Ian Drummond is asking, what drove the behavior of the managers described by you? Was it simply a response to the labor shortage and a need for industrial peace? In which case, why haven't labor shortages under capitalism had the same effect? And why was the shortages, why were they never overcome? What were their material interests and, as far as we can tell, ideological views? And were these the behaviors driven by fear of repression, especially in the Stalin years? I did ask the comrade if he wants to come in and ask the questions himself, because it's quite long. But he hasn't replied. Of course, he's also asking, to what extent do you think the USSR could be described as a siege economy with its external distortions driven by the early foreign threat and followed by the Cold War? And Carol asked, I think is my favorite question, what would be required to make socialism work? I wonder if we have time to get into that. Okay, I'll bring in Tim in that round of questions, and then we'll get Jack to come back on a few questions, and then we can bring the next round. There's 4 more people with their hands up at the moment. Hello, Tim.
Good evening. The point I'm interested in is, do you basically think it was either an economic failure or a political failure? I know they come together. Could one not argue that the fundamental problem was in fact centralized control, and of course the inability to counter dissent, which is quite essential for change? That together with the imposition of targets, which we know in more recent times, even over here under the Blair regime, has been not effective, that was the fundamental problem. And was there any possibility, does he think, that the market socialism of the type, for example, put forward by Poland's Oscar Lang, would have been successful? Because basically, is it not the real problem was a lack of the ability to express dissent, 2, the basic lack of competition within the market, but not necessarily the lack, the private ownership, and that we could have had a system with public ownership and it could have worked. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. I'm bringing Jack to reply to a few points. There you are.
Okay. Yeah, very interesting contributions and questions. I'll deal with them, I think, in the order that comrades spoke. Rick, you asked me about the role of psychology. Well, clearly psychology does play a role. We wouldn't simply say that psychology is irrelevant when it comes to human behavior, but also what I've tried to describe is that there were also material interests. So I absolutely accept the observation that those at the very top, you know, the Gorbachev and that immediate circle didn't benefit materially from the collapse of the system. You know, the first millionaires or billionaires, I don't know what, would either be well, mafia capitalists. It's either a mafia capitalist, but I don't think that you have to go that deep down the social pyramid in terms of the bureaucratic elite to find those that did substantially benefit. And if it wasn't those at the very top who benefited, often it was their children and all the rest of it. Again, the remarks about, oh, I'm not doing it in the right order. So anyway, sorry about that. I'm answering Rick, just different piece of paper. So I'm dealing with Rick now. Okay, so again, I take your remarks about the periphery, Eastern Europe, Latvia, Georgia, and all the rest of it. But what I'm trying to establish really is that if you take the system, it was no longer functioning. That if and I don't think it could have, if the system was firing on all cylinders, then I don't think you would have got the sort of rebellion in Eastern Europe or the Baltic republics and all the rest of it. In other words, what we were dealing with is some sort of structural crisis for the system of the sort that some Marxists predict with capitalism, some sort of final crisis of where, given the weight of internal contradictions, it collapses in on itself. You know, the particular role of Poland, the particular role of Georgia, the particular role of Yeltsin and Gorbachev and all the rest of it, I'm not trying to ignore, but I am saying that there are underlying problems. Let me now go back and try to deal with things in order. So I've got my pieces of paper in the right number. Okay, Lewis asks about state capitalism. I think I need to emphasize that I am not describing the former Soviet Union as state capitalism, either in 1991 or in 1929. How one describes the Soviet Union under the new economic policy under NEP, we can get into a particular discussion on. You know, clearly if we take the peasants, they were selling to a market of some sort. If we look at Lenin's description of the Soviet Union before he died, he used the term state capitalism, and indeed he said state capitalism would represent a step forward for us. But leaving that one aside, if we take the system that came into being with the first 5-year plan, i.e. the forced collectivization of the peasantry, and then this rush to industrialize, in my view, the description of that as capitalism makes no sense whatsoever. As I've said, I don't think that there was any money. I don't think that the ruble was money. It was a partial equivalent. Money is a universal equivalent. There was no capital. There was no wage labor. There were no capitalists. So the Soviet Union needs to be understood, in my view, according to its own laws and not according to the laws or categories of a different system. In terms of Trotsky, of course, he believed that the Soviet Union was some sort of workers' state, and that if you cleared away the elite, the workers would be there exercising control. Or maybe in the 1930s, who knows? Either way, I find it very hard to describe a system of where the workers cannot even organize trade unions, of where workers cannot openly express their interests, of where the workers are atomized as any sort of workers' state. It doesn't make any sense to me. And certainly, I mean, I have to readily confess, in 1991, although I predicted the end of the Soviet Union, I thought that there would be something like a political revolution. And in my view, either there was going to be a political revolution or the Soviet Union would go towards capitalism. Trotskyists at the time thought it was impossible to go towards capitalism, that there could only be a political revolution. Well, I was wrong and they're wrong. And all I'm saying is that rather than relying on old theories that had some sort of purchase on reality in the 1930s, if we look at actually what happened, we actually need to go back and re-examine those theories. Likewise, I would say that those Marxist-Leninists who believed that the Soviet Union was some sort of example of socialism, well, again, I would just look at the role of the working class or workers. I mean, did they defend the system in Eastern Europe? Did they defend the system in the Soviet Union? Well, no, not at all. If anything, they participated in the ending of the system. The question of 1917 has been asked. I mean, all I would say is, depending on how we use the word socialism, I use the word socialism as simply meaning the rule of the working class, and then a transition towards communism. I think you could describe Russia in 1917 as socialism, if you mean by that the rule of the working class. But clearly, you know, if you look at the ability of the working class to rule, it was already in decay, visible decay, by 1918. And I think people like Lenin and others in the Bolshevik Party were acutely aware of that. Certainly, if you look at Lenin's last writings, it appears to me to be something like a drowning man who's looking for an internal solution when there was no internal solution. The solution lay in Germany, elsewhere. Okay. In terms of what Mark was raising, was there a possibility of a social democratic outcome? Depending on what you mean by social democratic, I think not. Social democracy, in my view, relies on an imperialist exploitation of the world. So it's possible in Western Europe, but social democracy in a place like Russia, Poland, I don't buy that. That was clearly what Gorbachev's intention was, but I don't think so. Okay, just very quickly. Okay. Both Rick, well, let me just deal with Rick as well. Rick brought up this whole question of, I think, Rick, you brought up, or was it Tim? Anyway, the question of market socialism. In my view, the terms market and socialism are contradictions in terms. Market socialism, in my view, has to be an example of some sort of capitalism. It cannot be an example of socialism. Now, you can talk about NEP and we can get in to all of that. But all I would say is I don't think that attempts to go towards market socialism produce you a rational socialism. I think that they produce a capitalism. And I think that's precisely the tendency of various leaders in the Soviet Union. In their search for rationality, they look to the market. That includes Bukharin, of course. It also includes Stalin in his last years. It also includes Gorbachev. So I think that there is a constant tendency within the system for those in charge of the system to look for rationality, and they look for rationality either by exerting more bureaucratic controls, which then dysfunction, or they look to the market, which also cause the system to malfunction. So I think that how I would describe this system that came into being in the late 1920s and went into final crisis in 1991, I personally, I mean, it's not a particularly catchy phrase, but I would describe it as an ectopic social formation, or if you wanted, a freak social formation. It wasn't a viable society. It had no future as a system. It had to come to an end. How it came to an end, when it came to an end, that's a secondary question. But it had to come to an end. It had no future. can I just answer lastly the labour shortage and under capitalism? Well, I would actually point out that when capitalism has a severe labour shortage, for example, when I was very young, yes, what you saw is very powerful trade unions and the workers moving towards a position of where they exercise increasing control over production. And yes, the capitalists fight that and they seek to break that. And they either break it through the introduction of new technology or they break it by the importation of labor from abroad. In the Soviet Union, as I've argued, managers had a material interest in having a quiet life, and that made them actually resistant to the introduction of new technology. But yes, they were in fierce competition with other enterprises in order to get hold of a chronically undersupply of labor. Just to point out that the Soviet Union employed virtually every woman. It even employed old age pensioners. The labor shortage was visible, and they couldn't overcome it through the introduction of technology.
Okay, thanks, Jack. We've actually got 10 more people with their hands up. This is turning out to be our most vibrant session we've had, so that's good. But could comrades now please try to keep to 3-4 minutes in their contributions, please. Also, there's one more question which I'll read out. Maybe you could take a note. This is from Diana, who's basically asking: was the seeds of the destruction of the USSR, was it sown in its original structure, in its centralized structure? Could it ever, last longer? Also, she's talking about the environmentally devastating outlook of the USSR, and it's in contradiction to Marx's interest in nature and ecology. Thus, this wasn't really a Marxist straight right from the beginning on that level, as well as on other levels. There were signs of interest in ecology under Lenin, but that was destroyed under Stalin. Why was this? Okay, so there's 10 more people, so I'm bringing in Marie first. Hello, Marie.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, all good.
Hello. It's a very important discussion. I'm very grateful to those who have worked for this. I think we should just keep going, returning to the subject, because so many things have been touched which require much more analysis. To start with, I would say myself, I do not believe that the Soviet Union has completely collapsed. I do not believe it. I think it has entered another phase, which results from yet another configuration in the world. And if you consider the revolution, in my opinion, the revolution took place because there were world contradictions as well as internal ones. And it is there in Russia, in that place that nobody expected, which was so particularly backward, and yet it is there that there was this leap, which was one of the most extraordinary and unexpected thing to happen. And so I see the Soviet Union in its construction, in its development, and in its so-called collapse. I see changing world relations which have expressed themselves organically there, but which express themselves also in other places like China and Cuba and things. I don't think also that the experience has been destroyed. I don't know whether anybody said that, but the experience has not died, and I think that the actual Bolshevik way which it took in the beginning is not replaceable, because Bolshevism was intelligence consciously handling the economy and putting intelligence at the head of the economy instead of putting the market. And this is an audacity which is world-shattering, which nobody can retake. And the proof of it is that for the first time, the collective sort of organization, which includes, by the way, in its own way, the NHS in this country, this could only be conceived of once one had conceived of collective planning for everyone. The universal interest instead of the interest of one person or the other, or one country or the other. And this is what Bolshevism represented, and it continued itself through the Third International, and I don't think we should forget that either, because when these things were lost or were not kept or degenerated or were lost, then that laid the foundations for this new experiment of human audacity. It laid the foundations for it not to succeed, because in order to succeed, it needed to expand. I always go back to my experience in the car industry. If you had a factory occupation in one place, there was only two ways to go. You had to go back to work, or you had to extend the strike to other places. And this, in my humble opinion, is what happened. The Soviet Union needed to expand. And if it didn't, it was going to go through tremendous difficulties, and then eventually it would be forced on its knees. But look at the time it took. 70 years, and I think perhaps more, and it actually maintained itself in front of the nuclear threat. And I don't think we should forget all these things, because it's easy to make a technical assessment of what happened internally and the relationships between internal mechanisms in Russia or in the Soviet Union. But it had to deal with a counter-revolution that was constantly on the watch out and constantly probing and constantly trying to interest the self-interested. So in any group of people, you've got those who want to advance themselves. Just go in and fish there and give them loans and promises and show them the bright lights of the West, and you will have a movement which wants democracy. And so I think one other thing, which if I have another minute, I would like to point out that the Soviet Union, actually, there would have been no China revolution without it. And then there was Cuba. And then there was, in its own way, Vietnam. And then there was the colonial revolution. And imperialism changed. When it saw what the Soviet Union achieved, it changed. And now it was going to go all out to bring it down and bring it down. This is why now they are preparing for nuclear war, something that nobody ever mentions. And they are preparing it against Russia and China, precisely because they are an example of the audacity that we can have and the successes that we can have, because they have influenced the world and made communist parties. And it is a shame that the communist parties have abandoned the international and in the end returned each one to their national road to socialism. This has contributed to the failure in the Soviet Union.
Okay, thanks, Marie. Bye-bye. Mark Metcalf, please.
Good evening, everybody. I can remember as a young person in the 70s meeting members of the Communist Party and them describing to me the politics of the Soviet Union. And my thought was that this was some sort of workers' paradise. And that's certainly what I hoped. However, like a lot of people, I then discovered that the workers' paradise, it killed many of its most famous leaders and many members of the working class. And this for me was a bit of a shock and a surprise and left me feeling quite horrified. And I suspect many working class people felt the same when they found out the situation. It appeared to me that those people who were in the Communist Party basically saw their enemy's enemy, in other words, the Soviet Union, against their own state enemies as therefore being their friend. And they were more than happy and prepared to overlook and to defend the mass slaughter of many working class people in these countries. And I think it's that which is a central weakness which exists in this political discussion. We can't have a society which is working class, killing large numbers of working class people, imprisoning them and killing them. That, however, is not my main point at this stage. At the same time, as a boy and as a steward, and that one of the things that I did feel was that the effectiveness of the Soviet Union, in essence, was that in this country there was contradictions, and people could use that contradictions perhaps to gain advancements in their own workplaces and locations. The threat of socialism, at least in itself, imperfect as it was, could be something that people could utilize. And I just wondered if Jack felt that there was in any way in which the sheer existence of the Soviet Union benefited the working class across Western Europe. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Mark. Peter Kennedy's asked another question in the chat, and he's basically asking if the existence of the USSR, despite its bad levels of economy and productivity, was of interest to the US. Did the US have an interest in maintaining the USSR and the Cold War? Okay, I'm bringing in Carol now next. Hello, Carol.
Thanks very much. My question is very simple. How or can we make socialism work? How are we going to make it work? We've seen it not work in so many instances. For instance, very early Christianity was pure communism. Everybody gave in what they had and people were given as they needed. So that was pure communism, but that didn't work. That didn't last either. So how can we make this work?
Very simple question, and yet so difficult to answer. I think democracy is the key answer, but I'll bring in Alan Gibson now to ask the next question. Hi, Alan.
Hi.
Right.
Okay. When Jack described what he thought were the two key issues regarding the collapse of the Soviet Union, he pointed primarily to, well, exclusively to internal dynamics. And I think it is important to throw into that there was active intervention by international imperialism, particularly from the United States, and it wasn't just, you shouldn't just see it within the context of the national boundaries of the Soviet Union. Jack attacks Trotsky for his use of the term degenerated workers' state, because it was no kind of worker state at all, because the working class did not rule, as they indeed did not. But that posed the question of what is your alternative description, and what is your analysis of the class relations in the mode of production. As Trotsky once said to Shachtman, I'll concede whatever term you want to describe the Soviet Union under the Stalinist leadership of the Stalinist bureaucracy and their rule. But what is important for us is, whatever we call it, what are the tasks that we see for communists in relation to this social formation? And those can be broadly seen, I think, as the need for a working class revolution to place the working class into political leadership, removing the Stalinist bureaucracy, and defence against capitalist restoration. As Jack said at the beginning, very early on in his initial presentation, capitalism scored a victory with the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think that's clearly true, both in terms of what happened in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, in terms of the devastation to the working class there, but also internationally. And I think that means that communists should have had a side in the conflict that occurred in those 3 days in August 1991. I presume Jack, well, I don't know what Jack thinks now. He has for a long time disagreed. But if indeed this was a great victory for capitalism, I would have thought we should have opposed it, whatever we called this society. I think we can agree that the Soviet Union was originally a workers' state following the Russian Revolution. It was the period of the dictatorship of the proletariat, which follows the overthrow of capitalism and the capitalist state power. And there's the period of transition to socialism, when you don't have classes and you have effectively changed the social relations and entire mode of production. The problem was that the Soviet Union got stuck in that period, and you, instead of the state withering away during this period, as was projected in Bolshevik understanding, as outlined most clearly, I think, in State and Revolution by Lenin. Instead, you had a state which consolidated and got more power and less power to the working class until there was effectively no working class component to the rule. And so the plan and what Jack calls plan value was completely broken from use value. But clearly something happened in the late 1920s, to use Jack's timeline. I might put it earlier in the kind of mid to late 20s, but we'll leave that aside. At the beginning, he described it as a society which evolved in the direction of an anti-working class regime. And I felt that in the way he described the transition in 1991, being that the CP leadership, for varying reasons, basically gave up. So you're also evolving, you're proposing an evolution to capitalism in 1991. When in fact, I think there was quite clearly a political counter-revolution in the 1920s. And also there was a social counter-revolution in 1991. Finished, just on 4.
Thank you very much. I'm bringing Alec now. Hello.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Tina. I think Marie had an interesting way of putting things when she said that if your workers on a strike, sometimes your strike needs to expand to other workplaces, or you'll end up going back to work. And that's quite an interesting way of describing the situation the Soviet Union was in. Now, there's been a bit of debate here about what the Soviet Union represented, what terminology to call it, was it a workers' state, etc. But I think if we stick with the sort of analogy of trade unions, the idea of a trade union is very pro-worker. You know, it's the idea that rather than fighting things as an individual, you get together with your workmates, not just in your own workplace, but across your own industry and across the whole country, to collectively defend yourself against the bosses who want to use you as best they can to exploit you to make the most amount of profit out of you. So when you look at a trade union, though, in practice, it's a great idea, what I just described there. But in practice, a lot of trade unions it doesn't feel like they work like that primarily. Within a trade union itself, you have trade union members at the very sort of bottom rung, if you like, on the shop floor. But you do have a group of people who work for the trade union. You have a group of people who lead the trade union. And actually, they seem to have quite different interests sometimes to workers on the floor, on the shop floor, both politically and industrially. And yet, I don't think we would say that just because some of the leaderships of the trade unions are so entwined with the establishment that they will do things like, you know, take knighthoods, become lords, sign off on deals that are fundamentally bad for the workers, etc. Just because they're like that, we wouldn't write off the trade unions as not being a workers' organisation. We'd say that it is a workers' organisation, but its leadership is degenerate and it's contradictory, and therefore there's a fight as workers, not just for your own interests in terms of, you know, pay deals and stopping bullying at work and all that sort of stuff. But there's a kind of second battle in a way, which is making sure that your own organisation is fit for purpose. And I think in a way with the Soviet Union, it had that same kind of contradiction. It did have people who worked for the apparatus of the party, who were the leadership of the party, etc., who had very different interests to the ordinary workers of the Soviet Union. But it would be wrong to write it off as not a workers' state. Because of that, what was necessary was for the workers to have their own kind of political revolution, where they curbed the excesses of the bureaucracy and made the party and the country work for them rather than for the party workers. But there's a reason that the Soviet Union started off well and went on to degenerate, and it is because, as Marie said in the original analogy, the strike didn't spread to other countries, or when it did, it was defeated. And so it was because Russia was such a backwards country, because it started off with a majority of peasants, who were people who were, illiterate. It was basically kind of semi-feudal, semi-capitalist, and socialism was what's supposed to come after capitalism. So it was quite behind where other countries like Germany and Britain were at the time. Because it was so backwards, you couldn't get to socialism just in Russia. It had to be the spark of a European and worldwide revolution, where the more advanced countries like Germany, England, all the rest of them took part in it and ended up sort of taking the lead on it. And because that failed, and there's different, it's a whole other topic. That's why this sort of bureaucracy was able to sort of crystallise in a kind of similar way to how a trade union bureaucracy does, because the trade union bureaucracy needs capitalism. Trade union bureaucracy needs the bosses to negotiate with and to ensure a system where it's got members paying in the dues to keep the bureaucracy as the bureaucracy. So I think that was kind of the problem. In terms of today, I would say that the Soviet Union is incredibly useful to learn from, but the specific conditions of Russia just are not there today. We are not a peasant country anymore. Most countries are now pretty fully well developed under capitalism, which makes the transition to socialism a lot easier. Literacy rates are better, all the rest of it. Far better technology. Planning an economy now will be so much easier, all the technology we got compared to how the Soviet Union were doing it. So, and the other thing is, because capitalism's expanded, it means the numbers of workers have expanded. If you look at the numbers of workers on a world scale, you've got more workers now than ever. So that means you've got more potential people whose interests it's in to fight for socialism, where it means they run the economy rather than the bosses. So I think in some ways, although it's had a lot of step backwards with the Soviet Union, it's a fantastic lesson to learn from, and we've got huge potential going forward in a way that the Soviet Union just didn't, because of the specific time that it came about. So as not to go on, I'll leave it there and hope people found that useful.
Thanks, Alec. Yes, very useful points. It was a study of, I think, a few years ago, where the working class officially became the biggest class worldwide. They're guessing these things, but it's definitely about 10 years ago, I think, where the working class became globally the biggest force. Jack, we've got another 6 people, so I'm wondering if you want to come in now with a few things. Yeah? Okay.
That's a good idea.
Sorry, Conrad.
Okay, again, lots of questions, and I'll do my best to answer everything, but so forgive me if I don't manage to do it. And I'm also very acutely aware of the time. Okay, in terms of Diana, the environmental record of the Soviet Union was bloody horrendous. Even compared with the destruction wrought by capitalism, they did better in terms of destroying nature. The most obscene example, I think, is the use of nuclear bombs, literally to dig a canal. I mean, bombs that, of course, leave radiation everywhere. So yeah, the record was horrendous, but I don't think it's just a question of centralization. I think what we need to understand about the Soviet Union, because it didn't work, what you had is a leadership that would zigzag towards centralization, and then it would zig away towards decentralization. And with each failure, it would zig back again. So we had periods of decentralization, of where managers, for example, were given considerable autonomy. And when that didn't deliver, then the center would reimpose control. And when that didn't work, you saw a turn towards the opposite. So the point I would make, though, is that we were dealing with a dysfunctional system. Okay. In terms of what Marie was saying, I mean, just as an aside, of course, the Russian Revolution was expected. The Russian Revolution didn't come out of thin air. If you read Marx and Engels's last preface to the Communist Manifesto, that's when they were both alive, they're predicting the Russian Revolution. They're also predicting World War I, what we now call World War I. The question is, what was the nature of the Russian Revolution going to be? Was it going to be, as the Mensheviks wanted it to be and expected it to be, a bourgeois revolution that would introduce capitalist progress? Or was it going to be something else? And if you take Lenin and you take Trotsky, they believed it could be something else. But what they all agreed on is that any progress towards socialism, and that included Lenin, Trotsky, but also the Mensheviks, had to rely on the class struggle in Europe. And I think that if we want to talk in terms of, Alan, I think, talked about various moments of breakage. If you take the publication of the second edition of Stalin's Foundations of Leninism, which I think was in 1924, he came out with the idea of socialism in one country, i.e. we can do it in isolation. Other countries will help, but we can do it by ourselves. Russia is a vast country, and with planning, we can go all the way. That was the proposition. Well, I think that life has tested that to destruction. Marie says that the Soviet Union didn't collapse. Well, of course, that's in a certain sense, everything is a continuity. But nevertheless, I think in any common or Marxist understanding of the system that came into existence in the late 20s, i.e. with the first 5-year plan, I think it did collapse in 1991. What she says about Cuba and China, I can't deny that they've copied, not now of course, Stalin's model. That's certainly true, and lots of other countries attempted to do it. But I would distinguish the history of the Soviet Union from China, Cuba, Eastern Europe, Mozambique, Angola, whatever, because what I would say, and what I think we need to stress, and I don't think it can be stressed enough, is that the Russian Revolution was a working class revolution in a way that the Cuban Revolution wasn't, and the Chinese Revolution wasn't. We can get into what they were, and obviously we haven't got the time to do that. As to then rerunning history, you know, without the Soviet Union, what sort of a world would we be living in? I just think that that is impossible to answer, because for all her positives, I think there's negatives, and that's already been referred to by other contributors, that if you take one of the capitalist biggest weapons, it was the Soviet Union. So as well as fearing strong communist parties in Italy and strong communist parties or strong communist party in France, the biggest weapon that they've had is go back to Russia, look at Russia, no democracy in Russia, miserable living standards in Russia. So yes, the Soviet Union clearly represented some sort of threat to the capitalists. It represented the threat that there can be another society other than capitalism, but it also represented a paradoxical strengthening of capitalist control over the working class. And I think that's what Peter Kennedy was trying to tease out of me. Thanks, Peter. Yeah, and in terms of, how should I put it, Stalin's industrialization drive, I think it clearly, it worked to begin with, it worked to limits, but it also had absolute limits to it, which were seen even in the 1970s. And it became apparent to those in control of the system in the 1980s that the system had no future. Okay. Mark, I mean, I agree with much of what you were saying there. I mean, all I would argue is if, you know, Stalin's purges had been an aberration, and that if the system itself could have worked, which is what people like Deutsche believed, then you would look back and you'd say, well, the birth of the system was bloody and foul and horrible, but it would have some sort of historical justification. But given it ended in failure, given it ended in collapse, yes, the system was murderous. It ceased being murderous after Stalin's death, but the system didn't work. The system not only malfunctioned, the system came to its inevitable end. Alan, well, of course, I accept that the Soviet Union was surrounded by hostile powers, and that would certainly be my explanation of, you know, why Stalin took the course that he did. He could see, if you read him, I think in 1931, he talks about, we don't industrialize and within 10 years, they will bury us, or words to that effect. It was a speech before business executives, right? So yes, he went for forced industrialization. They built a very powerful war economy. But in my view, the Marxist method does need to stress internal laws of motion, not just external contradictions. And Alan asked me, you know, what sort of mode of production it was. Well, my answer to that is that it certainly wasn't a mode of extended reproduction, right? It couldn't go for extended reproduction. And therefore, if you want to use that category, mode of production, it wasn't, because it couldn't reproduce itself over an extended period. Okay, what side would I have been on in August 1991? Well, I can tell you, not so young this time, but my position was that if you take the people that confined Gorbachev to his dacha, I thought that might provide some time for the working class to act. But I think now, looking back on it, it's clear that the working class was never going to act, couldn't act as a class. How can the working class act when it doesn't have a party, when it doesn't have any collective organization, when it doesn't have a collective consciousness of itself or a collective memory of itself? So I think that I was deluded in 1991. All I can say is, well, I've learnt since then, and I'm not going to keep repeating the mistake that I made in 1991. And I would call upon the left to do the same sort of thing. I think just repeating what Trotsky said, and he had many profound insights in terms of his analysis of the Soviet Union in the 1930s. When I read him, I'm full of admiration. But he's at the beginning of the system, and he got things wrong. And there's no crime in being wrong. And therefore, I turn to, I'm going to have to answer at the end, can we make socialism work? But this is why Alec, I think, is so profoundly wrong. The analogy of trade unions is all very well and good, except that what we saw in the Soviet Union was the development of an exploitative system. Workers weren't just parasited off. The system worked to extract surplus product off those workers, right? And that surplus product was not in any way under the control of the workers. So we weren't dealing with a set of parasites that leached off the workers. We were dealing with a system that sought to and did exploit the working class and the peasantry. And if we understand that, then we start looking not for simply answers in a corrupt elite. We actually need to look at how the system worked. And so this is an exploitative system that has limits to the exploitation of workers, and within itself has no future. In terms of planning, I don't think that the Soviet Union planned. It had a plan, but for Marxists, the idea of plan is about conscious control of the producers, the associated producers. That didn't exist in the Soviet Union. So I don't think that the answer's in technology. I don't think it's a question that the Soviet Union didn't have enough computers or something like that. What you need is control of the system by the producers. That did not exist in the Soviet Union. So finally, can we make socialism work? I think, yes, we can, but to make it work, we need to understand what the socialist project is. And certainly for Marxists, the socialist project is a global project. And it relies on us winning the core capitalist countries. And so nowadays, that would be the United States, that would be Western Europe, it will be Japan, countries like Korea. These are the countries that you have to win. Now, revolution might break out in a Russia, in a Brazil, but unless that revolution spreads very quickly to the advanced capitalist countries, then it will suffer something along the lines of the Soviet Union. So I agree that we are not in 1917, we're not dealing with Russia, but I think that the lessons of the defeat of the Soviet Union are still very pertinent, because we still have a lot of the left putting forward schemes of socialism in one country, that what we must do is win in Greece or win in Ireland or win wherever, and somehow we can then spread out. I think that the working class, to come to power, needs to be organized and coordinated at a global level. So, yeah.
Thanks, Jack. Very important point. Socialism in one country is not socialism. Okay, I'm bringing Zizek. I hope I pronounced that right. Thank you for waiting so long.
Hi, no, that's great, yes. I'm really coming from a position of enlightenment now from what Mr. Conrad's been talking through. And I just wanted to add the People's Republic of Walmart, written by How the World's Biggest Corporations Are Laying the Foundations for Socialism, a book that came up a couple of years ago, written by Lee Phillips and Michael Rozwadowski, which is well worth reading, because there's lots of lessons from the planning that went on in the Soviet Union that were adapted and learned from the regime in Allende's Chile, and it covers all sorts of things like that. Which and it's now the planned economy within Walmart, which beats the other kind of systems in production at the moment. So that's one thing I think is positive out of that experience. And I just wanted to agree that the terror and the political revolution against the working class was also a very important issue, as well as the fact that obviously the interventions of the Allies in 1920, which took place in defeat of the expansion of the revolution, and when the Allies in the Civil War and all these other things contributed to seed the collapse, as and I agree, in 1918 with what was being said. Okay.
Thanks, Jack. I'm bringing in Anne McShane, the next person.
Okay.
At the top of your head, that's better.
Okay, thanks. Okay, Anne McShane, Marxist based here in Cork, where it's raining, like you over in Britain. Okay, so basically, very briefly, what I wanted to raise was the fact that from the very beginning, there were problems. Clearly, from the day one of the revolution, there were problems. And what you can see from my recent reading of E.H. Carr was that there was a sense of siege. The Soviet Union, the Russian Revolution was in a state of siege from the very beginning. And that points obviously very clearly to the need for an international revolution, because you can see the situation that existed for the Bolsheviks and for the working class in Russia, to me, seems to have been ultimately an untenable one. On the dynamics of the period from 1917 onwards, you can see how, for instance, how there were factory workers' control, factory committees being set up. They didn't work because they were like sporadically spread out. They were local in their attitudes, and they lacked the ability, they lacked the skills and the expertise. The working class did not have those skills and the kind of skills and expertise that it needed. And that you can see also that in order to try and deal with the problems, and the Bolshevik Party and the Soviets kept issuing decrees, but lots of the time those decrees weren't taking effect because the situation was just so chaotic. And like, into that situation, the bureaucracy comes under Stalin, and then that resolves the problem in the sense of bringing about stability or apparent stability, but in a very negative way. So, I mean, for me, I think that, for me, it's been very interesting going back to read E.H. Carr, because as Jack Conrad will know, and perhaps other of you will know, I've been critical of the Bolsheviks in the early Soviet Union for its lack of effective action around the woman question. And some of the arguments that have been coming back to me have been, well, you know, they were in a situation where they couldn't make a great deal of progress on this question. That aside, I think it is clear to me that it was a state of siege and a state of chaos. Nonetheless, it was a democratic struggle despite all the difficulties until it came to Stalin, and when he took over in 1928. So, I mean, I think, for me, I think that it's very important to recognize that this was a very negative juncture, and not to, like, for instance, there's quite a number of Marxists discussing the Soviet Union, the history of the Soviet Union and the United States at the moment. And there's a tendency for them to go, oh, well, it was socialism of some kind, so we have to defend it. But I think the problem here is that what you end up defending is something which was repressive and which gave socialism a bad name, so that like many of the time that you're arguing with people these days about socialism, if they point to the experience of the Soviet Union, they'll say, well, people had no rights. You know, it was a state which was, the state was repressing the working class, and that people were so repressed that in the end, in 1991, they said, well, we don't want this system anymore. So I think we have to answer that question, and then therefore, because of that, I think we have to look and see what happened under Stalin, and not just go, well, it was still some kind of socialism, because to me, it wasn't. And the fact that it wasn't has as much of an impact on us today as the fact of its collapse. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Anne. And Nicholas Whittaker, please, is the next person.
Yeah, hello. Thanks, Jack, for the introduction and the answering questions. It was all very good. I just wanted to touch on the Trotsky's theory of a degenerated worker state. I think that in essence, it doesn't in any way really contradict your economic points on why the Soviet Union collapsed, because to call it a degenerate worker state is not to imply that the workers had control, it is to imply that before degeneration, the workers had control. And it was due to the fact that the material conditions in the USSR were so poor in its early stages, and the fact that the international revolutions, such as Germany and Hungary, and even the general strike in Britain had all failed, it forced the Bolsheviks to seize power and to disrupt workers' democracy. Now, they believed that they could act as a caretaker government with the party, and once the revolution had succeeded, they could bring back workers' democracy, but the contradictions within the party allowed the bureaucracy to assume an even greater role of power, which in effect, as Trotsky said, created a caste of bureaucrats who had political power. So in essence, the difference between the worker state that was the early USSR and the degenerate worker state, which was the late USSR, was that political power had shifted from the workers to the bureaucrats, and this kind of created this mirror image between, you know, the bourgeoisie in late feudal society and the bureaucrats in the USSR, whereby the bourgeoisie in late feudal society had economic capital, but they lacked the political capital, to which the bourgeois democratic revolution was a solution. You know, they would achieve democracy, but only they would have the vote, or they would be the largest number of voters through which they would have power. Contrastly, the bureaucrats had political power, but they lacked the economic power. And as Trotsky argued, there would be conflict within the bureaucratic class between the actual believers of socialism and these bureaucrats who worked within their material interests, as you say, towards capitalism, so that they could cement their political power with economic power, which is why many oligarchs in Russian capitalism became were either related to or friends of former party officials. And on the point of the regeneration through a workers' movement, Trotsky argued that only if there was a successful workers' revolution in the first world, so to speak, you know, the global north, only in such a situation could the workers be motivated to begin such a revolution where they could regenerate the Soviet Union. But as we know, that never happened. But yeah, my basic point is I don't think that saying that it was a degenerated worker state in any way contradicts the economic reasons for the collapse, and that in essence the degenerated worker state is just a term that describes the unique system that existed in the Soviet Union, which was neither strictly capitalist or socialist. Yeah, that's all.
Thank you, Nicholas. Andrew Ward, if you want to speak, could you please switch on your camera? Also, Matthew Jones, I saw you earlier in the speakers list that you want to speak, but I can't see anymore. If you want to speak now, anyone, please indicate now. This is the last opportunity. Okay, there's Andrew. Hello. You are mute at the moment. I'm trying to. There you are. Okay.
I mean, obviously, I think the comments slightly answered, but I have more clarification. Why do you? I mean, I did put in print this question, but I may answer it. Why do you think? Obviously, militant. I mean, I was in militant, militant sports, and then become militant Labour, in, sort of 1990s, and because they were very strong on the degenerated workers' state theory. But then you had Socialist Workers' Party or state capitalist. Why do you think the Trotskys or these left Europeans had these completely different ideas? Because obviously 1945, I would argue, was state, under Labour government, it wasn't a socialist; it was state capitalist. You know what I mean? There was social reforms and stuff like that, but it was state capitalist after the Second World War in Britain. You know what I mean? But why would you say the different groups had different theories? State capitalism was degenerated worker state, and if they're both wrong, I would also speak of what would you call it? Is there a label you could put it down to? It's not those two theories.
Thank you, Andrew. Stan is, I think, the last person from the floor. If you still want to ask a question, please indicate now. Thank you. Hi, Stan.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
I think, I mean, what's important to understand here is that Russian Revolution wasn't just Russian, it was the World Revolution kicking off, wasn't it? There was a World War, remember, and it was because of the situation of Russia in that it became the sharp end, or the weakest link, as Lenin called it. So we'd understand the Russian Revolution as a breakthrough, which started the world revolution of the working class. And of course it failed. The world revolution failed to come through, didn't it? It's yet to be done. But the fact that it was isolated when the German Revolution failed, and the various other places where there was a short run socialist republic, like in Hungary and in Bavaria, and that these things all failed. The German one was the important one, and once it was isolated, it was a goner. It was a matter of time. It was the only way that backward Russia could succeed, as the Bolsheviks anticipated. Was through the revolution spreading to advanced countries. So when Carol says, how shall we do it? The short answer is we have to make revolution in the advanced countries, and not just one of them. I noticed Diane said, it was not Marxist from the start. Well, yes, it's a bit like what Anne's saying, isn't it? It's the kind of the situation that early Soviet Russia had, was backward, largely peasant, surrounded by enemies. Lots of reasons why it was going to be a lot less than perfect. So it's not a question of judging it morally, that it didn't stand up on some factor or the other, but it was impossible for it to develop except by being rescued by revolution in some of the other advanced countries, particularly Germany. How to make it work? Again, if we're looking at countries, say, what about this country? What about that? How can we make it work in our country? That's the wrong answer, wrong question, isn't it? Because it's got to be beginning of a world revolution. The whole process of transformation from capitalism to communism through the transition period of socialism or working class rule, that should be understood on a world scale, and then it makes sense and everything becomes possible. On the state capitalism thing, I mean, why did people say state capitalism? I know Lenin put it in some particular phrase, he used that phrase, but yes, Tony Cliff used the argument about 1928 that it's not socialism and therefore it's capitalism, and that's not a very good argument. It's got its own way of working. This is what Jack's been working on, isn't it? What he's been elaborating is, let's examine the Soviet Union as it was, how it worked, and then we can understand it, rather than saying we have to choose between capitalism or socialism. It's in between. The transition from one to the other, they're both modes of production, aren't they, in Marxist terms, but the transition is not a separate mode of production. It's working class rule over the remnants of capitalism to transform it over a relatively long period. But that happens on a world scale, not in a country. That can happen on a world scale. What's the lesson? Alex said we must learn the lesson. Well, the lesson is not in one country, isn't it? That's really the lesson. It's in one country, it's inevitably going to be, as it was, an unsustainable system. Thanks.
Thank you, Stan. So we've actually got 9 minutes left for Jack to come back on a few points, and we still finish on time.
Okay, what about that, finishing on time? Okay, yeah, again, lots of very important questions and contributions. Zizek, I agree. I mean, I haven't read this book on Walmart, but what I would emphasize is that, of course, all capitalist firms, especially big capitalist firms, plan down to a minute detail. I don't know enough about Walmart, but I can guarantee that the workers don't like it, the workers resent it, and the workers do their best to fight back. In other words, yes, we can call it planning, and in that sense, planning existed in the Soviet Union. So you saw a lot of, for example, sophisticated mathematics developed in the 1960s. But the reality was that the workers resisted. Sometimes they did it collectively, but they certainly resisted as individuals. So if we look at the early first 5-year plan, one of the standard ways that workers resisted is just to leave the job. And you had a turnover of, over 100% of the workforce within a year. In other words, you would train people up for the job and they would leave for somewhere else, and they would leave there to somewhere else. Also, just to take a computer term, I think it's a computer term, I could be wrong, but GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. That you can have the most sophisticated computer, but if you're feeding in rubbish, if you're feeding in lies, if you're feeding in false statistics, you're not going to get anything reliable out the other side. And I think that was the experience of the Soviet Union. And that would be the experience inevitably of any exploitative system that isn't relying on, spontaneous mechanisms such as the market. And I agree, by the way, I think that Tony Blair's targets are a very good example of that. Just in terms of what Anne McShane was saying, I would just emphasize that this question of bureaucracy, it does go back to the very earliest of times. I mean, I think Lenin was clearly a sincere revolutionary. I think Stalin clearly began as a sincere revolutionary. The difference was that Stalin began dressing up emergency measures as the norm, indeed as the model for others to follow. And I think there has been disastrous consequences as a result. Yeah, and I agree with you that, if we take the failings of the early Soviet Republic, we need to understand that this was a war-ravaged, isolated state, threatened by imperialist powers. The chances of it becoming a shining example for us all to aspire to follow were nil. The difference was that if you take the leaders of the early Soviet Union, they readily admitted that. So I know a comrade who's done a translation of Zinoviev's speech to the Independent Social Democratic Party in Germany. He spoke in German, I think, for something like 8 hours. But in that speech, he's saying we're in poverty, we're in dreadful crisis, and only you are the solution for us. Stalin turned that on its head and said we have enough in the Soviet Union in order to take us to some sort of a paradise. Well, it wasn't true, was it? In terms of what Nicholas was saying, okay, the problem I've got with Trotsky's theory of a degenerate workers' state is not really with Trotsky. You know, there he was in the 1920s, looking at the, you know, the Soviet Union falling under the control of Stalin and Bukharin. Then we have the first 5-year plan, and we didn't have reliable reports. We didn't have reliable statistics. And what's remarkable about Trotsky's writings is how often he gets it right. All I would say, though, is to keep repeating what Trotsky said in the 1930s all the way to 1991, I think is a profound mistake. Because what it says is that fundamentally the system is healthy, except what we've got is this bunch of parasites at the top. But what I would emphasize, and Trotsky didn't finally get to grips with that, but he was talking about it, is what happens when this bureaucracy become exploiters. And that is the reality of what happened in the 1930s. If the bureaucracy become exploiters, if they extract surplus from the producers, and not just politically atomize them, but economically extract a surplus from the workers, to describe that as a workers' state is beyond me. Because the reality is that the workers rely on political power not to be exploited. That's what makes it a workers' state. It's not just nationalization, is it? It's the control of the working class over the means of production. And if the workers have control, then the category of surplus product becomes redundant. But that category wasn't redundant in the Soviet Union. It became a fearsome reality in the 1930s. Maybe in the 20s you could come up with a degenerate workers' state description. I would tend to go along with that. But I think something else comes into existence with the first 5-year plan. And what happens is you have a counter-revolution within the revolution. It wasn't a restoration of capitalism. It was the birth of a new system, but a birth of a new system that couldn't reproduce itself, and therefore at some point must come to an end. And it did come to an end. And there was no other possibility open for it other than coming to an end, because the working class could not, under that system, organize itself as a class. So what we saw is, yes, the bureaucracy or sections of the bureaucracy opt for market solutions, and inevitably they don't work, and you get a section of the bureaucracy basically saying, well, we can become actual capitalists. That's how I would analyze it. In terms of the question of why different ideas, well, all I would stress, and when I'm criticizing comrades for holding different ideas, I'm not trying to do it in an arrogant way. Oh, look at me, I've got all the answers. I certainly haven't got all of the answers. And I readily appreciate that these comrades were struggling with something entirely novel and entirely unexpected. And under those circumstances of having unreliable information, dealing with something that's historically novel, it's hardly surprising that people come out with partial truths and partial untruths. And that's not to damn them, right? That's just to say what they came out with has some value, and some stuff that we can still apply and still learn from, and some stuff that we have to reject. So if we take Tony Cliff, he said that the Soviet Union clearly, in terms of its internal laws of motion, isn't capitalist. Well, I agree with him. He didn't try to prove the Soviet Union was capitalist through its internal laws of motion. Well, to me then, how's it capitalist? And he then says, well, the Soviet Union had to compete with Nazi Germany and the United States in terms of arms production, and that forced upon it the necessity of accumulation. Well, okay, but then when you don't have wage labor, which he admitted, you don't have money, you don't have capitalists, you don't have booms and slumps, you don't have a market, how on earth does this category work? And especially, how does that category work when he says that the only other stage that the Soviet Union can develop towards is socialism? Well, that isn't what happened in 1991. And so what I find worrying is that the comrades in the SWP just repeat, almost parrot fashion, what Tony Cliff was saying in, what was it, 1948 or whatever. And ditto with comrades who adhere to Trotsky's theory. In many ways, there's much admirable about what Trotsky says, but clearly in terms of seeing this system last all the way to 1991, this did not accord to his predictions of the system, because he saw its extreme fragility surviving World War II. It survived World War II against all the expectations of the Trotskyist comrades, and it spread. It spread to China, as Marie was saying. It spread to Eastern Europe. We saw people attempting to emulate it in Africa, in Vietnam, in Korea. All of that was unexpected. All of that went against Trotsky's theoretical construction. Some attempted to explain it by turning to the theory of bureaucratic collectivism. Again, the problem I have with that is it simply attempts to give a label to the society, and almost that solves it. So you had labels of the Soviet Union being more advanced than capitalism, that was initially, and then you saw with Shachtman later on, as he became a Cold War warrior, that it was inferior to capitalism. I find that profoundly unsatisfactory. So that's why I've been emphasizing, I think the task of Marxists is precisely to try to locate the internal workings of the Soviet Union, the internal laws that led it to decentralize, to centralize, led it ultimately to failure, after showing some brilliant successes. We need to actually explain how it had a growth rate of whatever the percent was real, 20% in the first 5-year plan, or whatever the reality was, and why that inevitably ended up with the stagnation seen under Brezhnev and the eventual collapse of the system under Gorbachev.
Thank you very much, John. That was really very good. I think we've had lots of comments in the chat and on Facebook and elsewhere, where comrades are very appreciative of you taking the time to respond to all their questions. I think it was one of, if not the most lively session we've had so far, which certainly underlines the importance of putting on sessions like this. Next week, next Tuesday, we'll be putting on a session with Anne McShane, who spoke earlier, and Comrade Daria Diakonova, because it's the 100th birthday of the formation of the Communist Women's Movement. And we're discussing some aspects around that. So I hope comrades will join us with that session. And on this session, I think certainly the point was made, by Jack in particular. It was neither state capitalist nor a worker state, deformed or otherwise. It was something else, and we're not quite sure what it was, but we better work it out soon. Because it is still being used against us, because in the name of socialism, all sorts of crimes were committed there. So, and for us now, the task is also to, of course, fill the ideas of what socialism is and what communism is with some content, and that certainly is disputed on the left as well. Can you have socialism in one country? I quite agree with comrades who said, no, you can't. Please note that this Thursday we'll take a break from our series on labor history. Instead, the LLA in Merseyside is hosting a session on Black Lives Matter, and is a debate on, is the Labour Party institutionally racist? And they don't mean the anti-Semitism, but anti-Black racism and Islamophobia. So please visit our website if you're interested in participating in that. And thank you all for joining us in this session, and thank you very much, Jack Conrad. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.